tracking global corruption and threats that undermine our security. This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined by Donald MacKay and Robert Oulds from a similar sides of the spectrum, I would imagine, but very interesting view about the UK election. Well, the 20th of September 1988, Maggie Thatcher made her speech in Bruges. Let Europe be a family of nations, understanding each other better, appreciating each other more, doing more together, but relishing our national identity no less than our common European endeavour. That's what she said at the time. And it inspired the Bruges group to be formed. And we've been talking about the parties and how some of them might be relevant and how some of them might be dead. Well, UKIP is still going. We've got Reform now. Why are you now relevant, Donald?
Well, I'm not nearly as optimistic as Robert is about Reform. They're led by two massive egos, and I don't think Reform will do as well as the polls are predicting. I'm far from persuaded that Nigel will win Clacton. He didn't even ask us nicely to step aside because there's a UKIP candidate in Clacton. And, you know, there'll be a certain irony if Nigel loses the seat by the number of votes that UKIP get. That would be absurd. So if Reform don't win a seat at this election, I would suggest on Friday the 5th of July, they'll effectively cease to exist. Therein lies the problem. UKIP, for all its faults and failings, are consistent. We've been around for 30 years. We still remain the only party that's actually achieved what it set out to achieve, if you accept that we've left the EU. And we basically are committed to the same things. Sorry, there's a noise outside. I think there shouldn't. Reform was made up of people who left UKIP for no serious reason. They left because they thought that the fox had been shot or something. They left UKIP, set up their own party. Britain desperately needs an alliance of the right, so that all the wee parties, instead of falling out with one another and having egos in their midst, talk to one another. And even if they don't join, at the very least, they have pacts, electoral pacts. UKIP have formed pacts like that with some of the other smaller parties. So we're not standing against the English Democrats. They're not standing against us because we're similar. But we're not joining. We're still two distinct parties. We have spoken to some of the other small parties as well, and at least are in friendly dialogue with them. The exception is Reform. They don't want to talk to us. They are not interested in talking to us, which means there are quite a number of seats where UKIP are standing and Reform are standing. That's unnecessary. But they treat us with a complete lack of respect, which again is unnecessary. We don't agree on everything, but I would suspect that, as I say, Reform will only survive as long as they succeed, and that's far from guaranteed. And egos will fall out, egos will go their own separate ways, and that's where UKIP, we're here. We stand, what we stand for, broadly people know and understand that. We certainly stand for free speech, and we have Reform getting rid of candidates because Hope Not Hate don't like them, or because they say something silly. Free speech is free speech. I accept that when people are ill-mannered or use swear words and so on, that's not acceptable. But people should be free in this country to say what they like, and the only thing they're afraid of is the libel laws. In other words, don't defame people, but express an opinion robustly if need be. And Reform clearly don't agree with that, as Farage is desperately trying to say that people don't think like this and people speak when they're drunk and all that. Why can't we have passionate people saying what they think, even if we don't agree with it, even if we think they're saying something that's over the top? I'm not suggesting we should ever suggest that someone should be shot, which a Reform candidate apparently suggested of our former First Minister in Scotland. I'm not referring to that, but expressing hostile opinions about things that they don't like seems to me to be perfectly legitimate. And we're a party of free speech. We're also, UKIP, totally committed to getting rid of the devolved assemblies, which are a nonsense, including obviously the one in Scotland, the one in Wales, the non-existent one in Northern Ireland, and the London Assembly, which is a joke. Reform, as far as I know, do not support that. In fact, they go out of their way to say that they think default assemblies are great. So there are some important and significant differences within the parties, but at the very least, we shouldn't be falling out. We should be talking, even if we're not going to join up with one another, we should at least be communicating, and that essentially doesn't happen. However, it's a bigger fact that the Conservative Party are no longer a serious party of the right anyway, and as Robert has alluded to, we don't know what state they'll be in at the end of this election. So if you're right of centre, generally speaking, you believe in the freedom of the individual, you believe in keeping most of your own money and only paying taxes for things that are essential, that the state should only do those things like defend the country and have a proper police force, if that's your kind of broad views and that the state should leave us alone, who do you vote for? There's very few options out there. And that's why the parties who broadly are aligned with that kind of thinking ought to work together. And if there's one good thing comes out of this election, it may well be that the right will reorganise itself and get away from all the egos and all the sideshows and actually present to the public a cohesive set of principles which people can broadly agree with. We're not going to agree with everything, but we can broadly agree on a proper party of the right in the UK, and certainly, particularly in Scotland, where the right doesn't exist. And therefore, people are disenfranchised. They've got nobody to vote for, and they put their trust, as I did often enough myself, in the Conservative Party, who've got one thing that's consistent about them: they always let you down. They never do what they say on the tin. And as we've spoken about earlier, that's not an accident. That has to be deliberate sabotage by various people within its ranks. So I think reform are not going to be the big deal that everybody thinks they are. And certainly if they don't achieve electoral success, they'll vanish. Nigel doesn't like to be on the losing side. He never did. So if he doesn't get his seat, bye Nigel, whether it's over to see Mr. Trump or whatever he does, but he won't hang around. So there's a big gamble there. It is interesting, to be fair, no question about it. But UKIP are here, and we're fielding a much more modest 24 candidates. We would have liked to field more. But yes, we've been hit by people leaving for reform, and wouldn't be too surprised if some of them eventually come back because they realise there's nothing much there.
Yeah. You make a very interesting point, Donald, because you hint that your candidates may step aside if asked. Now, this is the 8th time of trying for Nigel. He's in Clacton. I think your man, Andrew Pemberton, is that right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
See, I know my candidates all around the place. So Andrew's standing in Clacton as well. Are you saying, this is an exclusive here on the Muckrakers, are you saying that if Nigel called Andrew and said, give us a chance, old chap, because you're dividing the vote, he would have stepped aside?
Well, I wouldn't want to speak for Andrew. I know of Andrew. I've not spoken to him personally. But as a general principle, you have to remember Farage only chose to stand about a week before nominations were due to go in. This should have happened a long time ago. I mean, I'm on the NEC of UKIP, the National Executive Committee. We have endless discussions about this. If Nigel Farage or Mr. Tice wanted, even on an informal basis, to have a chat and say, knowing that UKIP would field fewer candidates than Reform because we're a smaller party, where are you standing? And we won't stand there. That would be a big thing. We would have no problem with that. And we did that, as I say, with the English Democrats. We've got a good relationship with them. They're standing, I think, in 14 seats off the top of my head, and we're standing in 24. They're not the same seats. And we've got a couple of informal agreements with independents who are broadly in agreement with us. That's what we have to do, not fight one another. In my seat, in Scotland, in East Kilbride, we have a Reform candidate, a UKIP candidate, and a Scottish Family Party candidate who broadly all agree, I would think, on more or less everything, with one or two exceptions. But there's 3 small parties chasing the same vote. This is absurd, and it's Reform who are responsible for it because they just won't talk. They don't want to treat us in any way. And so Nigel is standing, and there's a UKIP candidate there. I don't think that was necessary. He could have spoken to us, and I have no doubt, even with our little difference of opinions, that we would be willing to step aside in some seats, not by any means all seats. And at any rate, we could have talked about it. We didn't even get that far. So,
well, it is interesting because you do say, look, every vote for Andrew Pemberton would effectively one less for Nigel. Less than 24 hours to go. If there were a call today, would you stand aside or encourage Andrew to stand aside?
100% not. No. I don't misunderstand me. I can't make up my own mind whether I want to see Reform win or not. The reason for that is because I don't trust them, and I don't trust them because if you ask Nigel directly the question, why did you leave the UK Independence Party? I doubt he'll be able to answer it because there was no reason. I was partly involved in all the various events that caused the trouble in 2019, and UKIP's NEC behaved absolutely correctly to protect the party from extremists, but that didn't stop Nigel from leaving. So he left to set up the Brexit Party for his own purposes, and now, as Robert has just given an account of how Reform came into being, he is acting regrettably in his own interests. Now, there's nothing wrong with that up to a point, but it also means that there's a lot of other people out there who want to help and who want the same things he does, and he's kind of looking down his nose at them, which is a crying shame. And so I'm simply saying that had at the very beginning, and UKIP made the effort to talk to Reform and say, right, let's sort this out. If we field 30 or 40 candidates, you tell us, well, let's not use the words tell us, let us discuss politely between the two of us where we'll leave you alone and you leave us alone. There's no reason why these conversations couldn't have taken place. Tice doesn't even mention the name UKIP. He does a David Cameron. He doesn't even acknowledge that you exist, such as his contempt. So how can we communicate with them if that's the way they behave? And we're more or less, not entirely, but we're more or less on the same side. We shouldn't be contesting the same seats. That's definitely true. But I don't think it's by any means guaranteed that in a week's time the Reform will effectively exist. And they're fly-by-nights. They're here today, gone. And I get people who used to be UKIP, who were passionate colleagues, who are now passionate about Reform, and will no doubt be passionate about whatever else comes along the road. We need, in the right, to work together. If we don't have to join, we can do electoral pacts. We need to do that. And we haven't been doing it. And that's why we've got tomorrow. That's why we've got a prospective disaster tomorrow. And we'll all pay a head.
We will unpack this more after Starmergeddon. Have a look at that. Yes. Robert, I want to come to you because you were chatting just before we came live on the show about your brilliant book, World War II, The First Culture War, and you were telling me, which published in August 2023, available in all good bookshops and a few dodgy ones as well. There you go. Oh, there you go. Shameless plug. And you were telling me, and I allowed you to have this shameless plug because you said it's really relevant to the election now. Why is that?
Well, we are on the cusp of a new conflict. Some people actually consider that we're already involved in a war. Certainly, British personnel, as well as from those from other countries, are serving in Ukraine, even if they're just in an advisory capacity. But that's pretty much telling them this is where press that button now. Essentially, it is very much a proxy war, and perhaps even more so that we are now in. And really, this was quite obvious that it's quite predictable in a sense that this would have come to pass. That with the changes in Ukraine, the overthrow of the Yanukovych government in 2014, democratically elected in 2010, it certainly had its problems. But it was that Ukraine then set itself on a course where it was predictable and of course I predicted that Russia would indeed invade. And that is what has happened. That doesn't mean that it's right and the loss of life. The killing is, of course, absolutely terrible, but it's quite predictable. And what we need to do is just look back at history and see how that area has been a flashpoint and a conflict for a millennium, essentially, between the Central European powers, which is now headed by the United States of America, and those towards its east. It's been a flashpoint, and it's been one of a cultural conflict, which really has been a conflict, a justification to create a casus belli for a war over land, essentially, and of course all the resources below that land. And this is what we see playing out now. And the cultural aspect is indeed, no doubt, an excuse for spheres of influence politics, for power blocks to wrestle over that poor country. And indeed, a different course should have been set for that nation, which would have guaranteed their independence and territorial integrity. We see now that there could indeed be negotiations underway that would result potentially in some wins for Russia potentially. That's what we see going, and there is we hear mood music coming out from the discussions that are happening behind the scenes. So that's something that's really important. But also, the Second World War was really driven by the identity politics, the politics that was about different racial groups having different worth economically and, of course, morally and socially. And this identitarian politics that we saw that was adopted by the Nazis and, of course, essentially damaging to that country and of course, the whole of Europe and large parts of the world as well, which suffered as a result of that ideology. We see that playing out now. It hasn't gone away to this day. We see those who are described as being on the left of politics, and we need to understand that the Nazis in Germany were on the left. They were racial socialists, essentially, and we see these people at work today, these sexuality socialists that have dominated the left, the so-called left of British politics, and the divisions that they create between the races, between ethnic groups, between religious groups, and attaching moral worth according to one's colour of their skin. Absolutely absurd sort of politics, but we see this happening, and it's a division that is created in our societies now, and it's tearing countries apart. And I think it's being done for a reason, because it enables elites at the top. It keeps people divided. It keeps them vulnerable. It stops them uniting against big corporate interests and often rent-seeking organisations that just want to exploit and, of course, just want to pull in cheap labour. And that's something which, in a sense, the Nazis were absolutely in favour of. We think that they would be somehow against immigration. They weren't. They pulled in people from abroad, but they were pulled in people as a slave class, as helots essentially, or as what we would now describe cheap labour. Because the Nazis had exceptionally cheap labour because they were slaves. They were often murdered, but not always. There were different groups were of course treated differently, but there was always that economic element of pulling people in to exploit them for those at the top to gain to benefit essentially. And so it would be socialism for the rich. It would be socialism for those who are of the right ethnicity, and exploitation for those at the bottom. And that is the politics of mass immigration that we have now. That's the politics and the economics of the countries, the United States, European countries that want to pull in people for their exploitation. It's just the names have changed, the uniforms have changed, but the politics is eerily similar, and it's something that is un-British. It's something that's the Anglo-Saxon world, where you value people according to what they can contribute, be their character, be their economics. That's something that we would value. But European politics was always about the issue of race and exploiting people and giving to reward those of different ethnicities. And that's the politics that's being introduced into this country, and that's the politics that dominate Labour. And it's just the names have changed essentially, and different racial groups are now at the top and different ones are at the bottom. But it's the same divisive politics. And I think the true people, the true left has been harmed by this, and those on the left that adopt this have, in a sense, been fooled. But parties like the Workers' Party, headed by George Galloway in the UK, they reject this identitarian politics and these rainbow flag waving corporates, because they know that actually it's there to divide people, essentially.
Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers and me, Andrew Eborn. I'm joined today by Donald MacKay and also Robert Oulds, and we're unpacking the UK election and potential Starmergeddon. Now, Keir Starmer has accused the Conservatives of desperate tactics in these last dying hours of the campaigns. He says that the Tories' criticism of his defence of family time, this I've got a clock off at 6 o'clock on a Friday, is insensitive and also had anti-Semitic undertones. And that the reason for this is his wife is Jewish. He's made it very clear they're bringing up their children in the Jewish tradition. And obviously Fridays, that's the time, the traditional Shabbat, I think it is, you would have your family time and clock off. Is that a fair criticism? What do you think, Robert?
Well, Keir Starmer, Blair without the flair, he's always very keen to play the race card. He's chucked out people in his own party, such as the Labour candidate for Chigwell, someone who would potentially be a rival to him on grounds of anti-Semitism, when, of course, all this lady had done is like a few tweets. He's someone that throws around these accusations to keep himself in power throughout, of course, Diane Abbott, an ally, very close ally of Jeremy Corbyn, and of course throughout Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, on these grounds. This is something he likes to throw around, and perhaps it's not necessarily going to be helpful to his cause, because he has lost a lot of support amongst Muslims who would traditionally be voting Labour, because his policy is very pro-Israel when it comes to Gaza, and has left sort of an opportunity of the Workers' Party to take up that cause and take votes from Labour, probably not enough to have any significant effect on the election, especially as the Muslim population lives largely in safe Labour seats and in Britain's cities, which would be racking up a large Labour majority anyway. So it might just dent the vote to some small degree, but not to a great deal, which I think is unfortunate, because Keir Starmer having a supermajority, well, it's going to be an opportunity for them to power through the changes that the British public do not want. We are in the absurd situation that, of course, you used the phrase of getting Brexit undone. That was a title of an article published by the Bruges Group, wrote by our friend and colleague, Dr. Frank Millard. And of course, Dr. Frank Millard also made the point that we are going to be electing in this country a government with which the British people don't actually want. They're going to have a large majority, no doubt. That is presumably the case according to the polls, but they're going to have less votes than Corbyn got in 2019. And the British people want controlled immigration. They want Brexit to be done. That's something that they've supported. We don't want to be paying so much money in taxes, and yet we're going to be electing a government which is essentially going to be doing everything the British people do not want, because, of course, people have been so badly let down by the Conservatives. So we're in a rather absurd situation with this election. And Keir Starmer, I would say he's a threat, but then in a sense he's not going to do anything different to what Rishi Sunak has done and will do. So really, why not just vote for however you want? If you have a good local candidate, a good Conservative candidate, or one from another party who is actually going to stand up for this country and at least say something about immigration and have some plan of stopping it and stopping the migration crisis that we're fighting, then that's something then we need those voices in Parliament and doing something. But perhaps it's too late, as Lord Green had already explained.
Okay, Donald?
Well, if there is one good thing comes out of all this, the silent majority are far too silent, far too, dare I use the word, lazy. They don't get involved in any way, shape or form. And if the Starmer government is as bad as we might imagine it to be, then these people might waken up. As far as this, one of the things I would always challenge is the idea of the wasted vote. There's not much point voting for this party because they won't win. I've always believed, and still do believe, that UKIP contested the 2015 general election and got 4 million votes throughout the UK. They didn't, I think they only won one seat, which was ironically Clacton, which was already held by Douglas Carswell. But for 4 million seats, 4 million votes, there was no seats. Yet there's no doubt that the fact that you were hovering around in the background meant that the Conservatives rethought their position on the EU. And there's absolutely no doubt that David Cameron did not call for a vote on the EU referendum in 2013 when he called it, because he thought it was a good idea. It was to try and shoot the UKIP fox, which backfired on him. So I would always argue for people to vote for the party that's closest to their views. And even if you don't win seats, but you get 5% of the vote, 6% of the vote, somebody somewhere is watching, because people do look at the polls and they do think, well, why is that small party that's got hardly any supporters getting a few hundred or a few thousand votes? It shows that there's an undercurrent of people who agree with them. And I can't help, as Robert has very correctly said, we're going to get a government nobody wants, and we'll possibly get it because people who should vote for one party end up voting for a different party. And while in one sense that's understandable, tactical voting, it would really be much better, whatever your point of view you have, that the government of this country is elected to broadly reflect the views of the electorate, and that's not happening. And a lot of the reason why it's not happening is because people are voting for a party that they see as the least worst option, rather than a party which actually represents the views that they have. So the small parties invariably do badly. They never have enough resources. They win their deposits, save their deposits. That would be regarded as a result. My suggestion is people think, don't just vote for the usual suspects. They're all the same anyway. They all say the same things. The people with the most sensible ideas and the people who analyse things more carefully usually end up bottom of the poll, because they're not very good at getting the attention of the media, which in the UK and particularly in Scotland is absolutely dreadful. They ignore any kind of common sense and will interview anybody who's got all kinds of nonsense to say. So it's difficult to push your ideas forward other than possibly on social media. And people tend to say, oh, I'm not voting for him, although I agree with him, he's not going to win. And I'd like to challenge that kind of thinking. The small parties can amalgamate into bigger parties, as I said earlier on. But if we don't exist or nobody pays any attention to us, then ultimately they will disappear. And yet they do represent a core of thinking that's maybe not represented in terms of the votes they've got. And I'm saying, no, vote for the party that's closest to your thinking. And our party, at the end of the day, I think I won't go over it all. You broadly know we want to get rid of devolution, which no other party does, that I'm aware of. And we're firm on free speech. And we're certainly in the climate skeptic camp, and in the COVID was a nonsense and lockdown was a particular nonsense camp. No other parties kind of accommodate that, but these opinions are by no means unusual. They're just not represented on the political stage.
Okay, thank you. I want to look briefly, if we may, at what life might be like. And I say might because nothing's for certain yet. What life might be like under Starmer. What are your views, Robert?
Well, it will essentially, what's the difference between the Conservatives of Rishi Sunak and Labour under Starmer? The Conservative Party has pushed and enabled, allowed, encouraged mass migration. They are the party that's allowed the Blairite inheritance to continue and be built upon with steroids. They've enabled, given more powers to the regional assemblies, from Wales having an assembly to now having a parliament, to giving Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, the power to introduce ULEZ, and other taxes and restrictions on motorists. They have allowed the institutions, the long march through the institutions, to continue apace. They've, people think, in these 14 years they haven't managed to tackle these issues. They've been supporting the cultural changes that are being introduced, the culture war that's being imposed upon us. They've been pushing, they've got control of the Department of Education at central government. But of course, our schools are teaching essentially critical race theory to children who are 5 and 6 years old. They are pushing the trans ideology and the terrible implications that can have for some children. They've been pushing the green rubbish. I say rubbish. I do want to use other words. They've been pushing that, and then the net zero scam. So what's the difference? One is blue Labour and the other is pink Labour. It's not sure what the difference is really, and that's why when it comes to the election, so many Conservatives will be sitting on their hands and not bothering to vote, or perhaps voting Labour just to punish the Conservatives, or another party, be that UKIP or Reform. But the Conservative Party has been absolutely damaged by it not doing what it says on the tin.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. Only because time's against us, I did promise Donald, as he's standing, that he could have 30 seconds to tell us why people should vote for him. Your 30 seconds start now.
If you don't want a society where you won't get treatment on the NHS, you can't get a job in the police, you can't get your bank account closed because of your political views or your religious views, and you don't want that, you've got to vote for a party of the right, the serious right, and UKIP's, for me, the only one that's there.
There you go. That's a very quick 30 seconds. Thank you very much for that. I love the screaming headline on the Star is Kim Wilde, the 80s icon. She's backing Bin Face, and they're saying it's about the only sanest politician out there. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. I'll be back with you same time, same place tomorrow, and the Muckrakers. See you then.